for joining this session. Principles of Contour Lines and Agroforestry with Thomas Leonard. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Let's save questions to the end. He's going to repeat them. This is all going to be recorded. That way we can capture all of that information. Another thing, I gave you all some little pink cards at the end of the session. If you'll fill that out for us, that's super helpful in gauging the interest in this session and this topic so that we know what to plan moving forward. That's always, we really take that into accord when we plan these things. And I will let the host here introduce himself and what he's doing. So thank you all, and let's give him a welcome.
Thank you, Jackson. Great presentation again yesterday. Jackson talked about scissor doors on hoop houses, which was completely new to me and very educational. So thank you, Jackson, for moderating and for presenting. So my name is Thomas Leonard, and I'm going to give you guys just a brief background on myself so you guys will know kind of the perspective that I'm coming from and why I really value this information. So Modern Harvest Farms is my own LLC. I started a farm in 2015 with my cousin, Partnership LLC. We both put down like $2,000 and started leasing 60 acres. We did some hydroponics, organic produce. I did a lot of assisted natural regeneration on the property eventually. We didn't start with a ton of money, so we had to make decisions very frugally and, use my time wisely, use the financial resources really wisely. So I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that. But I've also done a lot of farm management. So I worked for Gaia Herbs for 3 years. I managed 350 acres of land, 170 acres of certified organic produce and medicinal herbs. And, we had a 40-man crew. So if in the morning I didn't have things together and nobody knew what to do, every minute was like hundreds of dollars going down the drain. And I had to be very efficient with my team's time, and I had to report to my boss and look at the income statement every month and the budget and see how I was doing in relation to what we planned. And so this presentation really, this is the way that I found to establish trees that is the most effective and the most cost efficient. But so moving along, I started this organization with Sean Dixon Sullivan. Sean woofed at Modern Harvest Farms back in 2017. Sean had been to 30 different farms. He'd kind of made a small career out of traveling around, and he was super knowledgeable. I remember giving him a little test one day and asked him some really hard farm questions, and he got both of them right immediately. So I really appreciate and respected Sean. We hit it off. He was going to stay at my farm for 2 weeks, ended up being there for 6 weeks. He mapped out my entire farm, every tree on the farm, which blew my mind. I had no idea how many pecan trees I'd been bush hogging around and persimmon trees I'd been protecting. But so yeah, it was super enlightening. I just got back from Guatemala, landed 2 nights ago. Sean lives down there now, has 2 awesome kids I got to spend some time with. And Sean's planted about 3 million trees down there at this point. We're working with over 14,000 farmers all across the country. It's mostly indigenous people on pretty marginalized land, steep slopes, high rainfall. Traditionally, everyone's done slash and burn corn, which doesn't really make any money. They're hand planting, using backpack sprayers to apply paraquat and Roundup to the fields. Every time it rains, the soil just washes away after they burned all the vegetation. And Sean came up with this idea of planting trees on contour and teaching people how to plant nitrogen-fixing trees. We use live stakes using Gliricidium sepium typically, plant those every 3 feet, and then we provide grafted fruit trees to folks for them to diversify their farms. And the result is that they rapidly accumulate soil from these erosion barriers that they've built on contour. They have really high value grafted fruit trees. You're seeing 7 to 10 times the income that they were making from growing corn. and they stopped burning the land. There's a ton of carbon being sequestered. So about 2 years ago, Sean and I decided that I was going to quit my job at Gaia, and we were going to replicate what we were doing at Contour Lines in the United States. So this is the map of where we're working now. We've kind of replicated that same model. In Guatemala, we started with one pilot site. We hired 3 guys to help us work. The next season, we went to those 3 landowners' sites and installed agroforestry sites on their properties, and they all invited 2 friends to help plant. And then the next season, we went to their properties, and at this point, we're at 14,000 farmers. And this is the kind of growth trajectory that we're looking at in the United States. We're going to plant about 63,000 trees starting tomorrow. I mean, I got a lot of work cut out for me still. Here's some examples of our different projects. So in the top left corner, this is Mansfield, Ohio. This is at the Richland Correctional Institute. It's actually where they filmed Shawshank Redemption. There's a historic prison there, and there's an active prison and jail on that site as well. This is NECIC's project. They've got a community farm that we work with, and Walt Bonham has created this awesome program that does rehabilitation with inmates and gives them some job skills. And you can see the raised beds there. They've applied compost too, and they're perpendicular to contour, unfortunately. I didn't help design that. But at the bottom, there's a riparian area there, and we've done this riparian buffer where we've dug all these ditches on contour. When that compost runs off those beds, we're capturing it there, and it's fertilizing our fruit trees. So it's been a really nice way for us to protect that watershed. On that same note, I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and at Carolina Farm Stewardship this year, I was giving a presentation, and I talked to 4 different farmers that are all in western North Carolina and some of the hardest hit communities from the hurricane. And everyone said that their berms and swales held the water. So I'm on, my site in Asheville is 0.79 acres, 1 acre of rainfall. 1 inch of rainfall on an acre is 27,000 gallons of water. We had about 20 inches of rainfall. So my property held about 500,000 gallons of water that did not go down the river and affect communities in Tennessee and just my neighbors a half mile away. The top left-hand corner, this is Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy. This is kind of a food forest. They're designing this site to be a pick-your-own orchard. So it's really diversified, a lot of false indigo. We didn't use any black locust there because it doesn't have thorns. All those white tree stakes are apples, and in between those are elderberries, service berries, persimmons, mulberries, all kinds of different fun edible stuff, and lots of nitrogen-fixing trees. Down here is another project in Ohio. This is someone's front yard. And they decided they wanted trees in their front yard, so I showed them how to use an excavator and dig it all up, and it's done really well. They've got like 20 different species in their yard, so tons of biodiversity, and really good growth rates, actually. It's a pretty wet site. Then in the bottom corner here, this is a silvopasture system. This is in Angiers, North Carolina. This is Ken and Allison Haggerty and their son Ethan helped with this a lot. They did a perfect job of all the things that we're going to talk about today. If you see in the top left-hand corner, you can see those rows. They actually did like Mark Shepard's whole planting scheme of like hazelnuts and apples and chestnuts. And they had probably 40% survival rate. Ken stood up at Carolina Farm Stewardship during my agroforestry pruning class and told everyone in the room that he had 100% survival, which I'm sure it's not perfectly 100%, but that they had really good survival. So these methods that I'm showing you are really good ways to get trees established, and I guarantee you they'll, at this point I can say after 3 years, that they do increase people's success rates. This is the first project that got me into this. This is my buddy Jackson's property. When I was at Gaia, he rented an excavator from his neighbor and asked me to come operate it for him. So we planted, there's actually like 5 rows of contour lines about 30 feet apart. And we planted 500 trees on this 1 acre. He had 2 cows, 5 pigs, 3 goats, 40 birds, 9 roommates. It was a lot. and they needed more fodder. So rather than, land was really expensive, you couldn't really buy more land. He eventually figured that out and leased some land from neighbors. But, he wanted to grow up and create more fodder, more fruit, more things that his animals could eat. I helped him plant it. We planted on St. Patty's Day, 5 roommates. We got 500 trees in the ground in a few hours. We got this nice decompacted soil from doing the excavator work the previous fall. And we planted a cover crop mix with a lot of rye. I helped him crimp the rye when it was at the perfect time to do that, right as it's starting to create some pollen. Dull machete, hit all these rye plants, and I left, and I actually, my sister was living in Germany, so I went to Europe and visited my sister, and, you fly that far. I stayed for a whole month. When I got back, I was like freaking out about this site. I had all this anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I'm like, man, those trees are all overgrown right now and doing terrible. And, so the first time when it crimped, it took about 5 hours. The next time I went to that site a month later, maybe 6 weeks later, me and Jackson walked around and touched every single tree, the beer in our hands, and it took about 20 minutes. And there was like no weed pressure on anything. And that's when I realized like this beats weed whacking, because I'm sure if you guys have planted trees, you've done a lot of weed whacking and probably killed some trees in the process. Here's another view of Jackson's property. There's my buddy James, but you can see there's a bald cypress, American sycamore, a whole bunch of like 12-foot tall elderberries. There's false indigo, black locust, all right there in that one picture. And that's like 2 years of growth right there, maybe 18 months. Like, you don't have to weed whack that anymore. And so today we're going to talk about these 4 simple soil conservation practices that we implement at Jackson sites, and I've been replicating with about 150 different farmers. So we plant trees on contour. I really promote this style of berms and swales because it saves a ton of time and you get really good growth rates out of it. Cover cropping any disturbed areas, and mulching. So to talk a little bit more about contour, the name of our organization, the first of our soil conservation practices, why do we plant on contour? Our goal here is to slow water and to trap water. We're trying to prevent erosion, whether that's manure from the silvopasture system. We're trying to keep our nutrient from running off the property and polluting the water. And we're trying to hold that nutrient on our system, on our land. This is really about regenerative agriculture. And if your inputs are leaving your property, you're not regenerating anything other than maybe the ocean, but it doesn't need any more nutrients at this point. And here's that. I already mentioned this earlier. 1 inch of rainfall is 27,000 gallons of water per acre. So if you have 3 inches of rainfall and you can keep that water from running off, you have just put 90,000 gallons of water almost into your aquifer, by the roots of your trees. You're holding that on your property. Here's an example of a couple different projects. This is Tony Fitz's project at the top. Him and his wife own a horse farm and do horse boarding, and they had a slope that was too steep for their livestock, so he wants to eventually rotationally graze alpacas in an agroforestry system. So that's his property over here in Marshall, North Carolina, pretty steep slope. This is my property down in the bottom left. This is a farm I planted about 2 years ago. I was really trying to pack in the trees. I'm doing a lot of propagating. I'm growing black locust for fence posts and firewood. And I've got elderberries and mulberries planted pretty densely in there for like wine. There's also some American chestnuts and hazelnuts and figs and all kinds of other fun things. Very close together. So we'll touch on that in a little bit here. The question was, how do you space your trees? And I recommend that people plant at a maximum of 3 feet apart. You'll see why as we go along. And I also made this cool little graphic here of the berms and swales, and that's kind of what your landscape might look like. And you could, in the bottom corner, go for a closed canopy and have those berms and swales really close together. Or you could, put them 60 to 100 feet apart if you're grazing cattle in between and doing a silvopasture system. So here's the tool that I use to mark contour lines. If I work with a farmer, I show up at their property. We might walk the property for 20 minutes. You show me where you want to work, and then I pull this water level out, and we get straight to it. This is known as a bunyip by a lot of the old permaculture guys, Australians, and the Kiwis down in New Zealand. But, this is ancient technology. This is how the Egyptians made the pyramids. I'm sure they were using intestines and not vinyl tubing like we use. But, I find that about a 1/2-inch diameter vinyl tubing is a pretty good width that the water levels out. If you use anything much thinner than that, there's a lot of capillary action. It takes a long time for the water to level out. And I use zip ties or these little nails at the bottom. But, this is extremely accurate. When I use a 50-foot piece of tubing, I'm standing probably here to the other wall from the farmer that I'm working with. 30 feet apart. And if we're a 1/2 inch off over 30 feet, if you do the math, rise over run is how you get slope. And if you times 12 by 30 feet and then divide that by like 0.25, it's 100,000th of a percent of a slope. And construction, less than a 2% slope is considered level. When you're getting your home inspected, they're looking for a 2% slope away from your house so that water will drain. Here's a picture of two guys in North Carolina using the bunyip. We found that it works best to fill it up with a hose, or actually Andrew, who does some work with us, one of our technicians, started siphoning it. So you got like a 5-gallon bucket and you just start sucking on the tubing, and then it fills up with no air bubbles, because getting the air bubbles out can be the hardest thing. If you do have air bubbles in the hose, you kind of can, use gravity or opposite of gravity, I guess, but you can kind of float them up and get them out of there. But that can take a while if you aren't careful. Here's an A-frame. I was talking to somebody in this room about A-frames earlier today. This is what we use in Guatemala. We started out literally just using like a rock and like harvesting branches off the property. But we've improved it. If you see, it might be Abelardo there. He actually just has one of those little tiny levels that you put on a string, and he has it zip tied to that piece of wood that's on that part that's parallel to the ground, the horizontal beam. And that's the best way to do it, because when you have like that string and you have a weight on it, it kind of blows in the wind and doesn't work great. This picture I stole from the internet, I included that because it's really important that when you do this, that you pivot it. If your A-frame's maybe 1% off, or let's say 2% off, and you keep sliding it down like that, then every time you're going off contour, and you can actually cause way bigger erosion problems when you're condensing all that water together and forcing it away than you might have otherwise. And so it's kind of like a basketball player pivots their foot. That's how you run the A-frame. I always flag out my lines before I start working. I like using different color flags for different elevations. So this is Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy's 17-acre silvopasture site. And you can see here each contour line, each elevation we have marked with a different color flag. And that way when you're excavating your lines, you don't get confused and run astray. I found a graphic similar to this in a book, and it gave me a lot of inspiration. I always dig on the upside of where my flag is, uphill, and then put the soil downhill. But I always invert the soil. So I take the top soil, and I'll like scrape off the sod, and ideally I want to do like a pancake, and I just try to flip it over so that grass is now upside down right at the base of my berm. And now I've got like double topsoil where I'm going to plant my trees. Which, if you have terrible soil, it's not a lot, but twice as much topsoil is always better than what you started with your baseline. And then I cap it with the subsoil, and this is like one of the secrets. And this is, people are always like, "Can I use my BCS and my rotary plow to build my swales, or a bottom plow or something like that?" And like, this is a secret to me. This is what saves you all your labor and stuff, is that subsoil is like sterile. I'm going 18 inches down, so when I bring up that subsoil, there's no roots in it. that are going to resprout. There's no weed seeds in it. I'm planting my trees now into like a sterile substrate. This is like certified compost without the nutrients. So I don't have to worry about a whole bunch of weeds germinating there. Like I always cover crop the disturbed soil, but now I can control what species are going to grow there, whether it's one species or a mix of species in my cover crop. You have a lot more control in your management in that first couple years while the trees are getting established if you have that subsoil capping your berm. So as I've already talked about a little bit, these berms and swales save a lot of work, but they also create this awesome microclimate where you have that wet area right there, and it actually dries everything out. You have this ditch, like if you have a clay field that you can't drive your truck in, you put these berms and swales in, now you can drive your truck in it. Now your cows won't get hoof rot because they're not walking around in wet soil. So it actually dries out the surface, around the area, only the top like 12 inches. So any perennial roots can get down there and still access the water. But you actually end up with like a great field because now you have you have less water problems, but you also have more water in your field at the same time. And you have this decompacted soil. The tree roots love it. And, I can plant 500, so this year I planted 1,000 trees by myself in a day. Because the soil is just super light. If you got there with a shovel, you get 10 holes in a pasture, and you're going to have like blisters on your hand. You're going to like want to go take a break, most people. But, with this, you're just popping it up, and it's like cutting butter. It's so easy to plant the trees. Here's some examples of swales holding water. This is a young farmer that's doing alley cropping in Durham, North Carolina. And that's one of my old farm. I drew this years ago, but I like including this picture because it kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. But yeah, like I said, I always move the soil downhill. It's easier if you're doing it with a shovel, but it also works pretty well with the tractor. You want to think about your overflow, and the lowest rung on the barrel, if you guys have ever heard this, it's actually really hard to find this graphic. But it's a thing, you talk about this a lot with limiting factors and nutrients and stuff for plants. But whatever your lowest point is going to be an overflow. So, if you're digging up rocks, you can pick those up and armor those areas. There's some pictures here from some guides from Peace Corps, I believe, where they talk about armoring. And this was a site that there were some drainage problems on the road, and as we were installing it, there was a little bit of blowout before we had roots established. Once you get a cover crop established, that's not going to happen. But initially, while we were constructing that site, we had like 6 inches of rainfall in a few hours, and that little spot opened up. But now that's the overflow. And they don't have any problems with erosion or anything post that, but I gotta get that picture out of here. It's not a great view, but something to consider when you're doing this and one of the realities. I also like doing hugelculture. I like burying logs into the system. These are just some little graphics online, but to encourage mushroom growth. Here's a picture. This is my first farm management job, and the first system I really did like this. We rid an excavator for another project, and me and my buddy Carlos, who I got to hang out with last week, came up with this idea, and we grabbed all these logs from in the woods, and we had an A-frame, so we measured out the contours, put the logs down, and then I dug above hill and dumped all the soil on top of the logs, and we grew cucumbers and mint and strawberries, and we worked with people with disabilities here. So we actually had apple trees and espalier on the fence right there so that people in wheelchairs could wheel up and harvest fruit off branches that we trained about 2 feet off the ground, which is something that they might not normally have the opportunity to experience. So I talked a little bit about cover cropping. This is Joe Belushi. He's a technician who works for us in Arkansas. He's handling all of our projects in Missouri, Oklahoma, and parts of Texas. I flew out there and worked with him a couple years ago, and he sent me this picture. So that's his like trees planted in there, but he has this awesome rye cover crop. It's a mix. You can see some peas and clover, I think, in there down near the bottom. But he's rotationally grazing his sheep in between his rows of trees as the trees are getting established, and he's a big fan of it. He's going around teaching other folks how to do it. But a big part of this is one that we're building organic matter with these cover crops, but we're also stabilizing the soils and preventing these landscape features from washing away. And sometimes, therefore, the next one's beneficial insects, I guess. But here's an example. This is Ken Haggerty. This is a guy who said he had a 100% survival rate and did an awesome job of mulching his berms and swales. And his son works for a company that sells cover crops, so they really perfected the mix. And it's kind of hard to see right on this giant screen, but that's like perfect germination of their cover crop in there, really thick. Here's one of my sites. This is my seed mix. There's African drum gourds and all kinds of old seeds I had mixed in there. I do a lot of wildflower seeds on my sites. Go through my old vegetable seeds every year and just dump all the packets that have gotten wet or just getting kind of old into my mix. One year I did a food plot mix. It was 1% turnips, and I harvested a pound of turnips from every foot of berm that I had. So I donated them. What are you gonna do with that many turnips? But still pretty cool. Here's some of the different species that we use. I really like clover and buckwheat because they don't grow that tall and they don't interfere with the trees. But then I really like my rye because it grows really tall, and I always think it's important to have functional things like pollinator species and some of the vegetables in there. One of the big things we've learned is that the cover cropping these berms is not a one-time thing. Do this frequently. When I terminate my rye, I always plant more cover crop, right? I plant a fall cover crop, I plant a spring cover crop. Even though I'm not tilling or doing anything like that, I'm still throwing out more seed so I don't have bare ground when the cold weather comes in the winter and everything dies back. But this shows you some more advantages and disadvantages of different species. So the rye cover crop produces a lot of biomass, 3,000 to 10,000 pounds per acre. And it's got this really high carbon ratio in terms of CN ratio. So it's kind of a woody material, a lot of lignin. It's going to take a long time to break down, whereas clover is going to have a lot more nitrogen in it and fixed nitrogen. This is from when I worked at Gaia Herbs. You can see some trees that are in their second year. They're getting pretty well established. We took the BCS in there. There's no berms and swales in this picture, but we just tilled up around the trees and did a pretty diversified cover crop mix. But you can see the buckwheat was super happy with when we planted it and the conditions. So that field was just like alive with pollinators, and there's no way that's affecting those trees that are standing up 2 feet above the cover crop mix. I also, if you're going to buy clover that's, white clover is like 350 pounds a bag, like put the straw down. This will help the seed from washing away, provides a little bit of protection and added moisture as they germinate. So, I don't require this, but if you got some old hay bales sitting around, this is a great opportunity to use them, add some fertility to your area and kind of invest that or protect that investment in your cover crop seeds. This is done probably thicker than you need to do it. One of my buddies, hydrologist, talks about what is it called? Saltation is when the raindrop hits the ground and soil jumps up. And he was saying you can basically see the soil still, and you don't really need it that thick to still get the same advantage. Now we talked a little bit about the rye cover crop and terminating it. In the top corner you can see I didn't even remove the plant. I just crimped it. And that was a dull machete. It was one of those Fisker machetes that they shouldn't sell. They bend if you hit a piece of wood and stuff. But I used one of those and did 500 trees in probably 4 or 5 hours. So it's a little labor intensive, but it's just 1 year. The Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy down here, you can see we're about halfway through this row. You can see the blue rye in there, And then you can see all the areas that we've crimped down. The first year, the trees don't really grow that much. It's really that second year that they pop. And you'll see, your 5-6 feet of growth. Some people can get 5-6 feet out of growth the first year, but I'd say that's more rare than common. So this site, we did 4,000 trees, and we kept track of the labor. We did a workshop and had people help us plant the trees. We took the time that it took us to mark the lines, the time it took us to excavate the lines, the time it took them to fertilize twice and mow above and below the lines once. 40 hours to establish 4,000 trees. So when I talk about this saving a lot of time, like 40 hours for your entire year, that's not a lot of investment and time to get 4,000 trees established in a silvopasture system. Here's another example. This is actually from the same time as I took these bottom pictures. But I had a sharp machete. I had my Brazilian machete with a wooden handle that's way better. And I actually was like cutting the whole plant off, just grabbing it in my hand, cutting it, and then taking those handfuls and putting it around these tulip poplars and American sycamore trees that are being grown for fodder. And and the cool thing is, like, we came back like 18 months later, because I did this in May. You end up terminate your cover crop in like May, June if you plant rye in the fall or spring. And the next spring, that rye is still there. That stuff lasted the whole fall, all winter long. And you come back in like March, and that rye is like, it's decaying a bit, but it's still there with that 80-to-1 carbon-nitrogen ratio. But this is a great way to kind of mark your small trees and really provide them a ton of benefits. But we don't. That's just one way to mulch your trees is with the cover crop. I'm a big proponent of wood chips in our area. And then at the top, this is my buddy Alex's site, and those are black locusts that we've pruned, and I actually planted a bunch of gourds underneath there. I run my BCS in between those trees, and then I lobbed up the branches on the black locust so I could get straighter, taller trees that I could use for fence posts or other things or firewood. Pruning also really invigorates growth. And then in that area that I'd tilled and planted my seeds into, I covered it all with the black locust leaves. So now I'm letting some phosphorus out into that soil. There's a little bit of nitrogen in the leaves, and I'm protecting that soil from rainfall, and it costs nothing. Kind of solve two problems at once. This is in ECI's farm in Mansfield. You can kind of see some of the trees sticking up there, but I was real happy when Professor Kent Curtis sent me this picture about a month after we planted, and their cover crop's coming up really thick. Trees are all doing great. It's really well mulched. Here's some other examples of mulch. The classic thing, you don't put it right up against your tree, like leave a little bit of space so you don't create too much vole habitat. The negative thing about mulching is that rodents do love mulch. But that's just part of life. And I always tell people to mulch to the drip line. This is our nursery in Guatemala, and this is what Dwight does when he prunes his rambutan trees. He just drops the branches right there. In my pruning presentation, there's an awesome picture where it's actually he puts his goat manure around the drip line, and that's where all the feeder roots are. Right by the base of the tree, there's not that much nutrient intake. A lot of the nutrient intake is happening from the furthest out roots that you typically find right around the drip line or the edge of the branches. But one thing here is the carbon. I was talking to someone else earlier today, I think, and the brown fertilizer, the carbon-rich sources, are just as important as the green stuff. The green stuff has the chlorophyll in it. It has the phosphorus in it. We were using an example earlier of talking about, I was at a site in Guatemala with a lot of citrus, and in the same field, there were some trees that had leaf miners and some trees that didn't have leaf miners. And I started noticing, and we went to 5 different sites that day. Every tree that had grass or leafy, dried up leaves around the base of the tree didn't have leaf miners because they put phosphorus fertilizer. They didn't import it. These guys are an hour away from the closest port, and you got to take a boat from the closest road in an hour, and then you have to walk another hour to get to their site. They're not bringing in bags of fertilizer. We're just growing it there on the site. And there was a huge difference from the trees that had that green manure and the trees that didn't have it. And then this is also the NECIC farm that you saw earlier that had the great cover crop coming in. And as we were installing this site, my buddy Skyler was doing the excavator work, and they had a giant pile of wood chips they hadn't done anything with. So I was on their Kubota tractor just picking up a scoop and dropping it every 30 feet. And we had an Earth Day planting event here. So when the volunteers came out, we already had the wood chips really close by. We didn't have to use any wheelbarrows, but every tree had like a nice little pocket of wood chips around it. And those trees look awesome today. I also included sheet mulching in here. If we're going to talk about mulching, we might as well talk about sheet mulching. This is not something with the techniques we're talking about here. You don't really have to sheet mulch, but if things do get out of control or you don't do a good job of flipping over that topsoil, sheet mulching is also a great way to protect some of the slower growing trees, get rid of the competition. I always, remind people to overlap the cardboard and put several inches on top. This doesn't work great on steep slopes because the wood chips kind of wash off the cardboard like a slide. But great technique for weed suppression and establishing trees. This is actually at my old farm. This lasted for like 18 months or like 2 years. I didn't have to like really weed that or like do anything. And it was like such a pain to mow around those trees because you'd have to like duck down. And I did a lot of mowing with a tractor on that farm that had very bad clearance. But that saves a ton of time and labor. So going back to, once again, that green manure. This is a farm right across the border in Ohio. This is in Patriot, Ohio. The McCutcheon's family, it's Debbie and her 3 daughters. And they're like in an Amish community. And they actually live in an Amish house, or they have an Amish house on the farm that they've owned for 10 years and have never put electricity into. I got to stay with them for a couple of days. Pretty cool experience. But they live in Columbus, Ohio, the rest of the time. And they got this growth out of like little tiny black locusts from Virginia Department of Forestry. They're about this tall above the ground when we planted them. And like in 4 to 6 months later, they got like 6 feet of growth. It's probably the best growth I've seen at any project. And all they did is they have 2 horses and they use wood chips as bedding. So they used that material and just had a light application of it on the ground. But you don't get nitrogen fixation without some phosphorus. If you think about photosynthesis and kind of that high school, college level of photosynthesis, the ADP, the P is phosphorus. You can't make cellulose and plant material without that phosphorus. So just, the tree's not going to be able to fix nitrogen, create those sugars, share it with the things in the soil if you don't give it a little bit of phosphorus, in the first year or two. Here's some other examples of some of this green manure, as I'm calling it, the leafy material with the phosphorus in it. There's a black locust up there in the corner, or actually I think that's American chestnut, but it has black locust around the base of it. And this is an Inga alley cropping project from Guatemala. This is a native nitrogen fixing tree that has really big leaves and like cancels out all the sunlight. So it looks like they sprayed Roundup here, right? Like it's like all brown, there's nothing growing. But they actually just had really like a full canopy of these nitrogen fixing trees. And then the guys came with their machetes, cut it all back, piled it up on contour. So they're creating these erosion barriers. And now they're going to plant their corn into that. No chemicals involved. They're going to have an awesome stand of corn because like there's nothing else growing in that field. And there's, a thick layer of mulch. Lots of organic matter. Here's Jesus at another site. This is Gliricidium sepium. But you can see him taking those branches and putting them around like I think it's a mango tree right there. But this slide's really talking about chop and drop, and that's what I keep pushing on here is I'm planting my trees 3 feet apart so that I have mulch. I'm growing my own wood chips instead of importing them. So you can see on the left side of this slide, there's, or I guess your right side, we've got a cool little thing that kind of talks about coppicing and just kind of like chop and come again. You can cut your trees back, get the wood chips, they'll resprout until you get enough canopy, and then eventually they stop resprouting because like the black locust, a lot of these pioneer species, they're not going to do well in shade. So eventually they'll die out once you start getting closer to a closed canopy. Have any of you guys heard of syntropic agroforestry? It's all over the internet. It's a very popular topic right now. Big in the tropics, big in Africa, Brazil. I think it's just another like name for permaculture, and like this Ernest guy just wants like his own name on his style of agriculture, but like people have been doing this for thousands of years, same as permaculture too. But this is the best part of it. This is the slide right here. The main thing you should take away from syntropic agroforestry or syntropic farming. And so the top right-hand corner, if you see this one with the great growth, flowering, fruiting, seeding, and death, that's the plant life cycle. If I always talk about cannabis in this part of it because it's like a really well demonstrated plant, and there's like a vegetative stage, and then when it starts like growing buds, you can't harvest clones anymore because it's like a completely different growth stage. And that's kind of the same idea here. Once something starts flowering, it's putting all of its energy into making that flower, making that fruit, and it's no longer in this vegetative stage. So you're not going to get any more biomass, essentially. Like, yeah, you'll get really nutrient-dense fruits and seeds eventually, but that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of sunlight away from your other trees and plants. So the idea here is that you prune right there when you start seeing flowering. And it's kind of a good rule of thumb. Like when something starts going to seed, like your grass, it's time to mow your grass. You're not going to get any more biomass. Same thing with rotational grazing. So the idea here is in this bottom corner, it's showing that they're growing their cover crop or their grass. They're growing their biomass trees, their nitrogen-fixing trees, maybe black locust, elderberry, false indigo, something that's going to be fast-growing, like using American sycamore. And then they have their crop, and maybe they're not even really pruning their crop back that much. Pruning obviously invigorates growth, and you see a big difference in things that are pruned and not pruned. So if you're pruning and you're managing your trees for biomass production, for fertility, for fertilizer, then this is something to definitely pay attention to. I found this picture this year. It's if you guys were in the third room over for the Farming for Life, he had some really great pictures, and this is my equivalent picture of this guy pollarding a tree that he's standing in. And then there's another picture of Jesus here, because these are just great pictures of him applying mulch to a line of trees. But this concept of nurse trees is one of the big ideas on this slide, and trees grow a lot better with like partial shade or other trees going around them than they're going to grow in a field by themselves. It's like very well documented in forestry, scholarly, peer-reviewed articles that like polycultures, the trees grow faster than monocultures, and the trees that are closer together initially have better growth rates early on. And it's literally their roots just working together. Every tree makes root exudates. So you have your apple trees. You know why, and this is kind of my theory here, so I won't back this with science, but you know why mice and voles always girdle apple trees? Because they make apple juice and they have this sweet sap that they really want. And that's the same thing. Their root exudates are going to probably be a sweeter type of root exudate that bacteria are really going to like. Your black locust is a nitrogen fixer. You know what's in those roots. We don't necessarily need to go over that. But each plant has its own little flavor of root exudates. It's going to support different biodiversity in the soil. So by planting different species really close together, you're going to start seeing those benefits in the first year. One of my favorite things about this conference last year was that there was someone here talking about, and he might be in this room, alley cropping with nitrogen-fixing trees. Went to like 6 different conferences. No one even mentioned nitrogen-fixing trees at any of the other conferences. In this trial, they were planting really far apart. And it's like, yeah, that's a great idea, but it's going to be like a really long time before those roots are touching, before you're seeing those benefits. So the denser you plant the trees, the more of them you plant, the more they'll be able to support each other. And then I always talk, these are pulled out of my agroforestry pruning slideshow, but, coppicing, this would be pruning the trees all the way back to the ground. Pollarding might be cutting the trees higher up. There's a ton of species that are really, really good at resprouting. I source like 40 different species of native trees that I provide to people as part of our Contour Lines Agroforestry grant, or tree planting grant. And, there's no shortage. People always ask me about conifers because they don't like a privacy barrier or whatever. It's like, yeah, we don't really source conifers because when you coppice them, they just die. They don't resprout very well. Most species, there's a few exceptions in there. But yeah, two terms you should definitely know and think about. Here's some good examples. This is that trip to Europe. These are willow trees in the Netherlands in this like super agricultural flower growing region in the northern part. And this farmer was pollarding his trees, and you can see how much growth he has there, how much fodder. If you have cows, it's a great dewormer having all those willow branches, and you can pollard the trees so the cows can't reach the branches and access them on their own. But then you can come through with a machete, chop it all on the ground, put your electric fence around those trees, and the cows will eat it and probably not negatively affect the tree as it resprouts. Then down at the bottom, this is an old coppice tree from England. That used to be the way that everyone grew their firewood, was through coppicing. And the idea was that you weren't cutting down the king's tree, you were just cutting it back and pruning it, and then it would resprout, and no harm, no foul. So, I've talked a lot about nitrogen fixing trees, and this is also one of the really important concepts to take away. We've got this slide here from rotationally grazing, because I think a lot of grazers understand that as an animal chews off the top of a plant, you usually see dieback in the roots in a similar proportion to how much of the top of the plant was chewed off. Part of the reason you don't want to overgraze and chew the plant all the way back down to the ground, because then there's not as much root for the plant to, and solar panel and leaf surface for the plant to regrow. But, the Hindenburg principle or whatever, the idea, you guys can yell it out if you know it, but the idea of fixing nitrogen fertilizer, it's a really energy intensive process. It takes a ton of fossil fuels and energy to fix nitrogen fertilizer. So it's these plants that fix nitrogen, they're not just giving it away for free. When they've produced this fertilizer, they've used a ton of energy to create it, they're going to hang on to it. So you don't really make that nitrogen and those root nodules bioavailable until you coppice or pollard the tree. And then when you do that, those roots die back, and what they leave behind are those little root nodules, which are just little balls of nitrogen fertilizer. And so that's a really big thing, yeah. That's all I got to say about that. There's a picture of some coppice trees. And we're getting near the end here, but this is a graphic I made, and just made it in PowerPoint. It's kind of silly, but you can see up here in the very top, I've got these support trees and apple trees growing together. And you see the apple trees aren't getting a lot of sunlight right now. There's lower branches, there's side branches. They're not photosynthesizing very much. Because we've got all these, let's say coppiced or pollarded black locust growing right beside it, and there's a lot of shade getting cast on it. So this would signal to you as a farmer that it's time for you to thin out some of these branches and go cut back those black locust to release. That's the forestry word for it. You're releasing the tree. You're cutting back the competition, letting more sunlight come in. You pile all your mulch down right around the base of the tree, ideally when it's leafy and green. and you're fertilizing your fruit tree now, you're also letting more sunlight in. So that tree is going to respond to that and grow a lot. And the next year, you're going to have to come in and cut more of your support trees back. Eventually, these apple trees are going to, create a closed canopy, and you're not going to need these support trees anymore. But by that point, you're going to have a ton of nutrient in your system, and this really takes place of a lot of input costs in terms of fertilizer and on pesticides. You have healthy plants, you don't have to spend as much on pest management. Here's that Wiley View Farms picture from the beginning. There's some of the false indigo and black locust, and this is kind of what parts of Jackson's farm look like today. That he actually doesn't even own a mower, and he doesn't have any livestock anymore either. But his trees are doing great, and you can see down there some of the material that he's pruned off and placed around the base of his trees. So that concludes the presentation. I highly recommend that you guys go to this website if you're interested in a project. Like I described earlier, we come out to your property, we'll teach you how to mark your contour lines, help you think about some design considerations in your site. And I ask that you borrow an excavator, have one rented, or other type of equipment that we can actually do the berms and swales right then, and I'll hop on the equipment, show you the technique that I use, show you the controls if you're not familiar with them, let you get on the equipment, and really by like lunchtime, I'm out of there, and you have all the skills that you need to operate that equipment and establish this system. And then ideally we do site design in the fall. Sometimes we do it in the spring, and usually like February and March, we'll give you trees, and usually start people off with about 700 trees, 1,000 trees, depending on your scale and the number of farmers that you're working with. So do you guys have any questions? Great question. The question was, what is the maximum slope that you would recommend? Most equipment's rated for like a 15 to 25% slope. It starts getting a little hairy once you get any steeper than that. Like, if you live in the mountains, there's probably some good old boy that'll take an excavator on something that's steeper. But it's pretty dangerous. They're not toys. You don't want to roll with that thing over. It's always important to wear the seat belt, even if you're not on a steep slope. I've tilted them before, and it's not a good feeling. Any more questions? What species do I not recommend for support trees? I really think you can use just about anything. Whatever's growing on the site. They're like, black walnut and magnolia have some properties that can discourage certain plants to grow. But anything can be used for mulch. Like, really, one of my favorites is sweet gum, because it's like really light. It's easy to chop up with a machete, and it grows in this nice straight thing. So you can cut down a little sapling, it's maybe 3 or 4 inches around, and then just run a machete down the side of it, and all the leaves just drop in a nice little pile. And you can even just do that right around the base of the tree. I don't spend a lot of time, I'm not going to sit there and put every leaf perfectly around the tree. But that's a tree a lot of people hate, but it's a great pioneer species. It grows really fast. If it grows on your farm, because they're very abundant. Yes, sir. So I always try to plant pretty soon. My work season's usually September to October. I even start in August and maybe further north. But that's really the time that I recommend doing the site design. And that allows you to have all winter for some rainfall to happen, and you usually rake out the berms a little bit after we construct them, but it's good for them to kind of settle out before you plant them. But sometimes, I've got 10,000 more trees to give out, so I might be there the week before I deliver trees, helping people get their sites ready, and then we'll plant the following week. There's pros and cons. Sometimes the roots become exposed after planting if you don't give it a lot of time to get rained on. Is there any advantage to planting trees on contour without the berm? Yeah, so in Guatemala, we don't have access to this equipment to do the excavator and stuff. People clean their sites with machetes by hand. And so we plant the trees and then we put logs on the uphill side of the trees, which is also a solution for slopes that are greater than 25%. And that's a really good way to prevent erosion and build soil really rapidly. I find that most Americans are not willing to put in the work to create, plant 500 trees like that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question was if you put in berms and swales and they're not exactly on contour, what's the downside? And so you're basically just concentrating water. And I do show people a lot, like kind of like key line design type things where, we might lay out our flags, and if there's a ridge, I might pick up that flag, and I want that to be the wettest area. So I want that to be kind of like a lower rung on the barrel where water will collect. So I might just move that flag like 6 feet. I don't get like super scientific about it. I'm not like pulling out my calculator and figuring it all out, but I'll just move it down a little bit. And that could become your spillway, but that's great because that means your water's like concentrating right there. And then, spillways are only required in unusual rain events, which is really when you have a lot of erosion. But for the most part, 90% of rains, like your swales will never fill up unless you're like in a really low lying area that already has hydric soils. So probably wouldn't recommend doing berms and swales there. But I worked with one person in Georgia, and they had like these really sandy soils that are really prone to erosion, and she eyeballed her berms and swales and caused massive erosion problems from doing that. So we've put in some new berms and swales. I recommended she put some new ones in below to catch anything that runs off when that erosion does happen. But you'll see what happens in rain events. You'll see where things are collecting. I mean, really, we're talking about slowing water here. So it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. But if you start seeing erosion, you should definitely address it with rocks, planting more plants in that area, trying to establish vegetation and armoring. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Cool. Mm-hmm. Cool. Cool. So he was saying that his berms and swales are intentionally done off contour because we get plenty of rainfall on the East Coast, and it's true. Like I don't know if anyone that I've planted with on the East Coast has irrigated their trees. A few people have, but 90% of people don't irrigate their trees and get great survival rates. He also said a really cool technique, and I've got a few farmers that have done this, where he's actually filling his swales in with wood chips. And I always encourage people to put any logs in there. If you shouldn't have a burn pile on a farm, in my opinion. You should just be putting all that stuff back into the ground. And these swales are a great opportunity to put some of that organic matter back into your soils. He said he's filled up his with wood chips, and he's allowed his wood chips to age down there where they've got plenty of moisture. And then he digs those wood chips up every few years, and now they're aged, they have a better carbon-nitrogen ratio, applies them to the trees, and then refills the swale with more wood chips. And it's really nice. One of the guys I work with in Texas and right outside of Austin, he did the same thing, and he likes it because he doesn't have, we use like a 24-inch bucket to do his swales, and he doesn't have these like giant ditches now. It's nice and smooth. You can walk across it. We've also put a lot of, they're native, but they're pretty invasive down there, junipers. They kind of take over the landscape. And so we removed some of those as we were doing this project. And it's kind of cool. It's like a trampoline when you walk on it now with the wood chips. You can like jump on it and bounce up and down. Yes, sir. I just started doing, when we did that project with Jackson, it was an 18-inch bucket, and bucket width, bucket depth. I can do about 3 yards a minute with that. And most people, when they first learn, they're easily at like 1.5 yards a minute within an hour. So it's super efficient. If you read the permaculture handbook, Bill Mollison recommends like a 45-degree slope. And I know some people that do that and charge a lot of money to install that on other people's land because it takes them a lot of time. And, there's one organization I do some work with. They charge $10 a foot for their berms and swales. And that adds up pretty quick. So, my idea is that, especially on steep slopes, these things, the sides start like eroding in, and you end up with a 45-degree slope in like 2 years. And naturally, a lot of these things will fill up. If you're in an area with a lot of canopy, a lot of leaves falling, a lot of wood, these things fill up in 2 to 3 years. You can easily fill them up with logs and organic matter. It's kind of like a slow composting system when you add organic matter into the berms and swales. Yeah, no, if you're planting these trees 3 feet apart in a line, that definitely counts as a hedgerow. And it's interesting where I was talking to someone earlier about how NRCS programs fit into something like this. My main comment would be that it's a way different timeline in terms of like application period, and it just takes years to get to that point. But I've actually got in my backpack, I've just started reading Mark Shepard's book, Water for Any Farm. And he actually writes that like based on NRCS practices. So like he's got like the CPA code, the conservation practice code, like 590 or whatever, written in there for each, for building ponds, for doing berms and swales. Like the terracing thing is a very broad definition, and it's like just basically have to do it on contour, but it could be a ditch, it could be a mound, it could be a combination of the two. It could be a flat area, like kind of like terracing and rice paddies.